There is a silence at the bottom of the ocean that no human has ever truly heard. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of a quiet night, something older, something that remembers. The deepest trenches of the sea stretch 7 miles beneath the surface. We have mapped less than 20% of the ocean floor. We have sent fewer people to those depths than we have sent to the surface of the moon. And yet, we speak about the ocean as if we understand it, as if its secrets are ours to keep. They are not. In the oldest tradition of maritime legend, the sailors of a civilization lost to time, a civilization we shall call, as the storytellers before us did, Tartaria, these sailors believed the ocean was not a body of water. They believed it was a mind, ancient, patient, vast beyond comprehension. And they believed that mind was inhabited by creatures so magnificent, so far beyond the scale of anything we now call natural, that to see one was to understand, instantly and completely, how small a human life truly is. These are their legends. This is their bestiary. And like all the greatest legends, these stories do not ask to be believed. They ask only to be remembered. Creature 1, the Veilmother. The first creature in the Tartarian bestiary of the deep had no single name. Different coastal traditions called her differently: the drifting sky, the pale curtain, the empress of still water. But the name that survived in the oldest manuscripts, the name that scholars of legend have chosen to preserve, was the Veilmother. She was not a creature you could see. That was the first thing every account made clear. You did not see the Veilmother. You saw what she did to the water around her, the way the surface changed, the way light bent differently in a radius of perhaps half a mile, the way fog gathered without wind, without cloud, without any meteorological reason to gather at all. And then, if you watched long enough, if the legend granted you that particular mercy or cruelty, you saw her edges. She was vast, not long, not tall, but vast in the way a weather system is vast, a creature measured not in meters but in acres. Her body was translucent, gelatinous in the tradition of the great jellyfish, but organized in a way that jellyfish are not. She had structure, architecture within her body, arrangements of luminous organs that pulsed in slow, deliberate rhythm. Sailors who described her at length always arrived at the same comparison, though they came from different coastlines and different centuries of legend. She looked, they said, like a cathedral seen through water, all light and structure, an impossible, breathtaking scale. The Tartarian legend held that the Veilmother was not one creature, but many thousands of smaller beings so perfectly bonded that they moved and thought as one. A superorganism, a consensus of life. Each individual piece was simple, almost mindless. Together they were something that ancient sailors described with complete seriousness as wise. She did not hunt, she did not need to. The ocean fed her as it fed the great currents, passively, continuously, a slow filter of everything the sea contained. She moved through the legend at a pace barely faster than the tide itself, a migration that took a lifetime. The greatest sailors in Tartarian legend were said to have navigated by her. To know where the Veilmother was to know something about the state of the ocean that no instrument could measure. Her presence indicated deep health, ancient balance, something correct about the sea. When she disappeared from a region, the fish followed. When she reappeared, the waters came back to life. The legend does not record what happened to the Veilmother. She is simply no longer mentioned after a certain age of the stories. She moves through the earlier texts like fog, and then like fog when morning comes, she is simply gone. Some traditions hold that she did not die but descended, that she dropped to depths no sailor's legend had ever reached, and continued her slow migration in the absolute dark, feeding, pulsing, thinking her slow, enormous thoughts, that she is there still, vast and patient and ancient, drifting through trenches 7 miles below the question of whether we believe in her. Creature 2, the Ironjaw serpent of the Northern Passage. If the Veilmother was mystery, the Ironjaw serpent was certainty. You did not wonder whether the Ironjaw serpent was real. You knew, because the Ironjaw serpent made itself impossible to ignore. The legend described it as long, extraordinarily, absurdly, beautifully long. Not in the slithering way of an eel, but in the way of something with architecture to it. Segments of body connected by joints that allowed the creature to fold itself through underwater canyon systems, to coil in trenches, to rise to the surface in spiraling loops that ancient sailors described as watching a city slowly stand upright. The head was wide and heavy, built for authority rather than speed. The jaw, the feature that gave the creature its name in legend, was bordered by calcified ridges that had fused over centuries of growth into something resembling hammered iron. Not actual metal, but the resemblance was what legend preserved. Old iron, dark iron, something that had been worked rather than grown. When the Ironjaw serpent surfaced, which it did rarely, and always with what the legend characterized as deliberate intention, it did not surface silently. The water around it disturbed first. a wide radius of churn. Then the loops would appear, the first coil breaking the surface far from where the head would eventually rise. Then the head itself, slow, dripping, facing some horizon that humans could not determine. Tartarian legend granted the iron-jaw serpent, something unusual among sea monsters, dignity. It was not presented as a destroyer in most traditions, though the scale of it made destruction inevitable whenever it moved through inhabited waters. It was presented as something old enough to have moved past aggression. Something that had lived so long in the deep that the surface world, with its ships and its nets and its noise, was barely worth acknowledging. The sailors who fared best in the presence of the iron-jaw, according to legend, were the ones who stopped trying to flee, who lowered their oars, who let the serpent look at them, if looking was what those ancient, water-filmed eyes were doing, and waited. The creature, the legend held, had seen enough panicking ships to have formed an opinion of them. The ships that went still were, perhaps, more interesting. One story in the bestiary ends with an iron-jaw serpent raising its head beside a Tartarian vessel in thick fog. The crew does not flee, they sit in silence. The serpent remains at the surface for what the legend measures as long enough for a full tide shift, then it descends, and the fog, unaccountably, clears. Whether the serpent cleared it or the timing was coincidence, the legend does not say. It records only what happened. The reader decides what it means. Creature 3, the Singing Dark. There are creatures in the Tartarian bestiary that can be described by what they looked like, and then there is the Singing Dark. The Singing Dark could not be described by what it looked like. It could only be described by what it did to sound. Deep water has acoustic properties that surface dwellers rarely consider. Sound travels farther underwater than in air. Sound bends around temperature gradients, channeled by physics into pathways that carry it for thousands of miles without significant loss. The ocean has a voice. A low, constant, ancient conversation of pressure and temperature and the movement of water against itself. Sailors with sensitive enough instruments, and certain sailors in the Tartarian legend were said to have been exactly this, could hear the ocean's conversation. The Singing Dark was part of that conversation. It was described as a creature of the sound-conducting depths, the layer of water where temperature and pressure conspire to carry noise the farthest. It was large, the legend held, though size was difficult to determine for something that was perceived through sound rather than sight. It was likely enormous. The sound it produced, the particular resonance of it, implied a body that could produce vibration at frequencies that large stone structures produce. Not a high sound, not a call exactly, a presence. A note that continued without pause, that seemed to have no beginning because no living sailor had ever been in a position to hear it start. The Tartarian understanding of the Singing Dark was profound and strange. They did not believe it communicated with other creatures of its kind. They believed it communicated with the ocean itself, that the sustained sound it produced served a navigational function, not for the creature's own navigation, but for the ocean's, that its singing somehow organized currents, influenced the behavior of water at distances that seemed impossible. That removing it from the sea would be like removing a load-bearing wall from a building. The sailors who claimed to have heard the Singing Dark, who had dropped listening devices into the right depth at the right location, described the experience as permanently altering, not terrifying, not wonderful, simply permanent, like having heard something that could not be unheard, a frequency that became part of their inner experience in the way that a significant event does, not remembered so much as lived inside of, even years later. In the Tartarian legend, the Singing Dark is not described as disappearing, it is described as going silent, and every tradition that records this moment records it as a catastrophe, not because anyone was killed, not because ships were lost, but because the ocean, they believed, had lost something essential, a note in a chord without which the chord becomes something else entirely, something less. The silence after the Singing Dark is the silence at the beginning of this story, ancient, patient, remembering. Creature 4, the Crown Bearer. Every bestiary has its king. In the Tartarian legends of the deep, that king was the Crown Bearer. It was a whale or whale-shaped, the legend was always careful to say, as if it understood the distinction mattered, larger than the great whales of any tradition, longer than any ship that sailed above it. Its body followed the expected architecture of the deep whale, the vast head, the tapered body, the enormous flukes that could displace the water of a harbor in a single stroke. But the head was not like any whale's head in the natural tradition. Along the upper skull, the crown bearer bore a series of calcified crests, natural growth, bone that had thickened and extended over centuries of life into formations that rose from the skull in layered ridges. The arrangement, the legend said, with a kind of helpless wonder, looked like a crown, not a rough approximation of a crown. Something that, if you placed an actual crown beside an illustration of the crown bearer's skull, would make a thoughtful person go quiet. The creature was bioluminescent in a way that seemed designed for ceremony. Faint lines of cold light ran along its body in patterns that suggested veins, or rivers seen from altitude, or the lit windows of a structure seen from the sea at night. In darkness, the crown-bearer moved through the water like a map of something, like a city made of light and living flesh, slowly circumnavigating the boundaries of its kingdom. The Tartarian legend held that the crown-bearer was not simply the largest creature in their mythological ocean. It was the oldest. Some traditions gave it an age that cannot be taken literally and must be understood symbolically, not centuries but epochs. Not a lifespan but a continuity. As if the crown-bearer were not individual animals that lived and died, but a single lineage of one, each crown-bearer the same crown-bearer, returned. Sailors who claimed to have seen it, in the legends that recorded individual encounters, did not describe the experience in terms of danger or wonder. They described it in terms that sound more like encountering a place than an animal, a landmark, something that had been there before the sailors arrived and would be there after they were gone, something that put their own existence in a particular and humbling perspective, not cruelly, but honestly. The crown-bearer, the legend says, did not disappear, it simply moved deeper, beyond any depth a story could follow. And in those depths, some tradition insists, it continues its slow and luminous sovereignty. Crown ridges catching whatever faint light trickles down from the world above, cold light tracing the ancient channels of its body, moving through water that has never been warmed by sun, through pressure that would crush any instrument we could send to verify it. Patient, ancient, crowned. Creature 5, the Memory Reef. The strangest entry in the Tartarian bestiary was not a predator. It was not a giant. By the scale of the creatures already described, it was almost modest, perhaps 30 meters of slow, deliberate movement across the ocean floor. It was called the Memory Reef, and the reason it was strange was the reason it earned that name. The Memory Reef was a creature entirely covered in living coral, not parasitically, not incidentally, but intentionally, symbiotically, in a relationship so old that neither the coral nor the creature within it could survive separately anymore. The creature's body was the reef's foundation. The reef was the creature's world. But the Memory Reef was called by that name because of what the coral remembered. The legend held that coral retains the chemical history of the water it grows in, temperature, acidity, the presence or absence of particular nutrients, a record, written in calcium and pigment, of the ocean's state at every point in the coral's growth. And because the Memory Reef's coral was ancient, old in the way that only things that are never truly finished growing can be old, its body was a record of the ocean across an incomprehensible span of time. Tartarian legend attributed to the Memory Reef something that the legend clearly understood was extraordinary even within the world it was describing. It attributed intelligence to the reef itself, not to the creature within it, to the accumulated record of the coral, as if memory, stored in enough detail across enough time, eventually becomes something that thinks. The Memory Reef, according to the oldest stories, could be communicated with, not spoken to. It had no mechanism for processing language, but certain practitioners in the Tartarian tradition had developed means of reading the chemical language of its coral, of asking questions by touching the reef's oldest growth and reading, in the calcium record, what the ocean had been when that growth was formed. It was described as consulting a library, a living archive of everything the sea had experienced, an entity that could not answer your questions about the future but could tell you, in extraordinary detail, what had come before. The legend does not record the Memory Reef dying, it records the loss of the knowledge of how to read it. The last practitioners of the coral reading tradition died, the legend says, without teaching what they knew to anyone who survived. The Memory Reef, the story implies, may still be there, moving slowly across some section of ocean floor, its coral still growing, still recording, still, in whatever way the legend grants it, still thinking. A library that no one can enter anymore, full of answers to questions we have not thought to ask. The subscriber pause. Before we continue into the deepest waters of this legend, before we reach the creatures that even the bravest Tartarian sailors refuse to name in daylight, if these stories have called to something in you, if you find yourself leaning toward the screen in the way that a good legend demands, consider subscribing. It supports the telling of more stories like this one, more mythologies recovered from the tradition of the imaginative and the bold. Thank you. Now, into the dark. Creature 6, the Glassfin. The glassfin was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, completely, without apology. It was a ray, or shaped like one, moving like one, gliding with the particular unhurried grace that rays have always had, as if they understand that the ocean will carry them if they allow it to. Its wingspan, in the legend, exceeded anything the natural world has produced, wide enough that a ship sailing under it at depth would have been, for a moment, in its shadow. The fins were transparent, not translucent, not merely thin, transparent tissue through which you could see with some distortion the water and the light and the world on the other side. The glass fin in still water was nearly invisible, a slight ripple at its edges, a shadow on the seafloor that should not have had a source. The occasional gleam when it banked and a fin caught the light and threw it back in fractured patterns, like sun through a window. At dusk, the legend said, the glass fin rose to feed near the surface. And this was when the sailors who had the fortune or misfortune to be in the right place could see what the legend was describing, the setting sun striking those transparent fins, the light not reflecting but passing through, the ocean surface full of moving glass, swimming windows, crystal sheets that caught the last of the day's color and scattered it in directions that light has no business going. The glass fin in the Tartarian legend was not a predator in any meaningful sense. It filtered the water, took what it needed from what the ocean offered in abundance. The legend granted it a particular quality that surfaces in the accounts of those who claim to have dived near one: curiosity. The glass fin, the stories said, approached humans with the manner of a being that had encountered nothing quite like them before and found the novelty interesting. Imagine being inspected by something the size of a house, something that could end the inspection at any moment by simply gliding away into invisibility, something that chose, for reasons entirely its own, to remain. The legend's ending for the glass fin is among the saddest in the bestiary. It was hunted for its fins. The transparent tissue had properties, the story goes, that made it valuable for purposes requiring exceptional clarity of vision. And the glass fin's gentle nature, its curiosity, its tendency to approach rather than flee, these qualities, the legend says with a bitterness unusual for mythology, made it easy to find and impossible to lose once found. The last glass fin in the tradition was seen approaching a vessel at dusk. The legend does not describe what the vessel did. It does not need to. It describes only the water afterward. The sun setting on an ocean surface that held no moving glass, no swimming windows, no fractured light from fins that were no longer there to catch it. Creature 7, the Deathless Tide. The final creature in the Tartarian bestiary of legend is not described in the bestiary. It is described in the spaces between the other descriptions, in the silences, in the things the accounts refuse to say directly. Every maritime mythology has one, a creature that the tradition approaches sideways, that the stories reference without naming, that the sailors of legend knew existed because of what happened in its presence, not what they saw but what they stopped seeing, what they stopped hearing, what simply ceased in a radius around it that the tradition described, collectively, as wrongness. The Tartarian legend called it the Deathless Tide, not a great predator, not a beast in any sense the bestiary understood, something older than the classification of creatures, something that had existed in the ocean before the distinctions between living and not living had been established, something that moved through the water the way a change in weather moves, as pattern rather than entity, as event rather than animal. Ships that passed through it reported afterward that everything went quiet, not the comfortable quiet of calm water, the wrong quiet, the quiet that your body recognizes before your mind does, the cellular understanding that something in the immediate environment has shifted in a direction that does not favor you. Those who returned from an encounter with the Deathless Tide reported that they could not describe what they had seen because they had not seen anything. They had experienced an absence. A section of ocean through which their vessel had passed where nothing was present, not fish, not bird, not the small creatures that make the background noise of a living sea. A gap, a lacuna, a place that the ocean had not populated because something in that place made population impossible. And in the center of that absence, according to the few accounts willing to go that far, something moved. Not visible, not audible, perceptible the way that pressure is perceptible, not through any specific sense but through all of them simultaneously, a wrongness that the body's entire vocabulary of alarm agrees upon without being able to specify the source. The Tartarian legend held that the Deathless Tide was ancient beyond the ocean itself, that it had been there when the first water gathered, that it would be there when the last ocean evaporated, that the creatures of the bestiary, the Veilmother, the Ironjaw, the Crown Bearer, all of them, had existed in a relationship with the Deathless Tide the way that life exists in a relationship with entropy, not in conflict, not in harmony, in acknowledgement. The other creatures of the legend are gone from the stories. The Deathless Tide is not. It is still there, the tradition says, moving through ocean that has forgotten the magnificent things it once contained, through depths that have not been visited and will not be visited, through the silence at the bottom of the sea. Waiting. Not for anything in particular. Waiting in the way that something waits when time is not a constraint, when patience is not a virtue but simply a condition of existence, when the things that were magnificent are gone, and the things that ended them are gone and the ocean remains and within it, older than any of it, the Deathless Tide continues its slow, wordless passage through the dark. Close what legend asks of us. These are the creatures of the Tartarian bestiary. Legends, every one of them. Stories from a tradition that understood something worth preserving, that the ocean is vast enough to contain anything we can imagine, and probably many things we cannot. The Veilmother drifting vast and wise through her slow migration. The iron-jaw serpent, ancient and dignified in the deep. The singing dark whose voice organized the currents. The crown-bearer, luminous and crowned in its impossible kingdom. The memory reef, a living library of everything the water has known. The glass fin, transparent and curious and heartbreakingly easy to find. The deathless tide, patient past the end of everything. These stories do not ask to be believed as history. They ask something else. They ask whether the ocean, as you understand it, is large enough to deserve awe. Whether the depths, which we have barely visited, which contain pressures and darknesses and silences that no instrument has adequately mapped, whether those depths are worthy of the imagination we have always brought to the unknown. The ocean is enormous. We are very small. The space between those two facts is exactly where legend lives. The greatest maritime traditions in human history were not built by people who thought they knew what the sea contained. They were built by people who understood profoundly that they did not, who sailed anyway, who told stories about what might be down there not because they were lying, but because they were being honest about the scale of their ignorance and the magnitude of their wonder. The Tartarian legend says the creatures are gone. The ocean says nothing. The ocean keeps its own counsel, in depths that no legend has reached, and no instrument has illuminated, and no story, no matter how long, no matter how bold, has ever truly followed to the end. The legends lived, the legends were magnificent, and somewhere in the dark water between what we know and what we cannot know, they continue. Not in fact. In something older than fact. In the place where the sea and the story were always, from the very beginning, the same thing.